there's no sense of America first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are America's interests? What are America's strategic interests? What do we need to do to preserve the United States, its power, its influence, its standing in the world?
Mm-hmm.
The British made this bad decision in 1914 to enter the First World War. Britain never completely recovered from the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
Then it repeated its mistake, put itself into a hopeless position that allowed FDR to bankrupt it and destroy it. And he was always the enemy of the British Empire. He took full advantage of the situation. So the British destroyed themselves, their standard of living, their wealth, their power, their influence, everything during the 20th century.
So we should have learned from them.
We are on the same road right now.
Yeah.
Truth has a power of its own. It moves hearts and saves lives. It heals wounds and restores souls, but only if it is heard. That's why our enemies are working nonstop to suppress the truth. That's why LifeSiteNews is the most censored life, faith, and family news source in the world. They are working to keep you in the dark. They are working overtime to make you feel alone and forgotten. But God says, I will never forget you. God never leaves us without hope of victory. And LifeSiteNews will never stop sharing the truth that sets us free. We will tell the truth without fear. We will tell the truth without compromise. And as mainstream platforms silence us, we will build our own. That's why I'm pleased to announce today the launch of the new LSNTV app, which can bring all of LifeSiteNews' top video content direct to your phone, tablet, computer, and TV so that you can bypass the censors and keep fighting with us for life, faith, family, and freedom. Don't be alone in the darkness. We've been canceled. Fight the cancellation. Download the app.
And I think at that point, I was in London in November of 2003. And at the time, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the British Army met with me, and he subsequently became a commander in Afghanistan. His name was Richard Evans, very intelligent man, and he told me frankly, he said, I think we've lost Iraq. And he explained to me that they've had thousands of Iranians who had been training for years in Arabic and local customs and so forth that had gone into Iraq as soon as the government was defunct, and settled in with the Shiites, whom they knew intimately, understood everything. In fact, many of them ended up as translators for us in the field, Iranians, and we didn't even know what we were dealing with half the time. And so his view was, we've blown it. And I think a lot of people recognize that by the spring of 2004 when we had this uprising, and the rest of it's history. But you always have the same problem. And in 2005, I spoke at Leavenworth, and I think it was at the time that Dave Petraeus had just been assigned there as a 3-star, and he was going to put together this little book with his friends about counterinsurgency. And he said, what do you think we should do in Iraq? I said, Dave, we should leave. We need to get out.
Good for you.
And he went, oh, no, we can't do that. We can never leave. I said, what? He said, if we do, then Anbar province will become a platform for the projection of terrorism all over the world. And I said, well, good luck with that one. There's not much in Anbar province.
Yeah, as if trying to occupy a country for 20 years, inflicting injustices on the civilians is going to increase insurrectionist or, just resistance.
But here's the key point, and this is what Europeans don't understand. I've tried to get this across repeatedly to them. We are preeminently a naval and an air power. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. If we put any troops on the ground, they're temporary. We don't live in Asia. We don't live in Europe. We don't live in Africa. So what are we doing there?
Yeah.
In other words, anything we do is inherently temporary.
Yeah, exactly.
Understand that.
Yeah.
The problem is that wherever we go, for brief periods of time, it's like sticking your hand into a bucket of water. As long as your hand's in the water, you displace the water. You pull your hand out and the water returns.
Yeah.
All we do is disrupt the regional dynamics temporarily.
Yeah.
And eventually those dynamics return.
Yeah.
And there's a readjustment period, especially as we leave. It becomes very, very obvious. Again, no willingness to look at reality. Who are the principal powers in the Middle East? Historically, there are two powers that run things in the Middle East. the Turks, and this, of course, was the Ottoman Empire, and before the Turks showed up, the Persians. Those are the two great powers in the region. And their cultural influence, their administrative influence, all of that is visible wherever you go in the region. You know, you see the Persians were here long before anybody else showed up. You go to Jerusalem and the Mamluk influence, and they, of course, were a group of people that established themselves. They were very Turkish-like in many respects. They established themselves in Egypt, but they were not Egyptians. And they drive out eventually the Mongols. And then not long after the Turks then move in and effectively drive us out of the Crusader states. In other words, take note of what's been here before. Understand who's running the show. It's just like the Balkans. Who's the dominant force in the Balkans, in Greece, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Serbia? Russia. All right, so before you do anything, you might consult with the Russians. Before you do anything in the Middle East, you might go to consult with the Turks and the Iranians. But we don't. No, we're right, they're wrong.
And that's how you not create allies and sustainable friendships.
Yeah, well, it's also called practicing economy of enemies. And that's how the British ruled a quarter of the world's population so successfully with a fraction of British people. Because they went in and they said, with whom can we do business? All right, let's do business with him and him and him. And who's the one that stands out that won't do business with us? Well, let's isolate them, get these others on our side, and then we can essentially take over and assert our interests. It worked. We do the opposite. You're with us or you're against us. Remember, that was George Bush's statement that came from this man from another neocon maniac. You're with us or against us. No, most of the world doesn't need to be involved. Most people are neutral, idiot. Forget it. Leave them out. Don't make enemies where there are none. But that's the way they do business. These are hard-edged, hard-nosed ideologues that believe they are right, everyone is wrong, and everyone must conform to what they want.
And they do so much harm. I mean, so much so that, I mean, when people listen to your podcasts or interviews, it's accelerating Ukraine, you know, the danger of an escalation with Russia is there, the escalation in Israel.
Well, I think we have some good news in Ukraine right now. And when I say good news, I mean, that's probably an exaggeration, but I think the people in Washington are sufficiently afraid that they are backing away from any sort of direct confrontation with the Russians in Ukraine. Washington has told Macron in Paris, forget it. Don't send any troops. I think behind the scenes we've told the same things to the British, but the British are too proud to say we were stupid, made a mistake. No one wants to back down from the outrageous statements of the past and the stupid policies
we are winning
that they embrace. Just we're winning, Putin is losing. It's just insane. But
you called it from day one. I mean,
of course. But you know, strategically, it's very easy to understand. You know, where somebody asked me, well, where would you stop the Chinese since you don't want to fight them in Southeast Asia? And I said, well, I think the ideal place for us to stop the Chinese is sort of in the middle of the Pacific. And he says, what do you mean? I said, that's where the United States Navy has all the advantages. That's where we can dominate easily from space, from the land, from the sea. And if anybody tries to cross the Atlantic against us or cross the Pacific, they've had it. It's not going to happen. And there's no sense of letting your erstwhile opponent or your competitor overextend themselves. And see, that's what we don't understand. That's what the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and others have all let us do. We've overextended ourselves. And now we are a shadow of our power in 1991. 30 years ago, the kinds of statements that Biden and his friends make, you could make. Incautious and ill-advised, but you could make them because you had the credibility of the force behind you.
Yeah, I mean, the exhaustion of running 20 years Iraq war. And what I also wanted to bring up is just the social effects on our own country next to all the suffering of the civilians over there. But when you go to a military base today, you see signs, suicidal thoughts, call this number, and the other sexual assault warnings. So you see, right going into any base, this is a military community that's falling apart. Because, I mean, we met on one base a soldier who was employed for 19 years. He was like a robot. I mean, what is this going to do to Americans, their families, this structure and cohesion of families, when they are, in war for so many years? We are destroying. It's coming back. It's to haunt us. It's destroying our society. It's exhausting our infrastructure. Where did we put all the money that was supposed to strengthen our country? Make this country flourish.
Sure. We
and that's one
squandered
of the points,
our wealth.
Yeah, we are squandering, and now we are in this moment where. Would you agree that it's time to tell these elites, the neocons, re-emerging under Biden with Blinken and Nuland just leaving, but still she did enough damage, to tell these neocons and their allies, this is enough. We want to take care of our own country. We want to rebuild this country and not go further. Keep funding Ukraine, keep funding Israel. Where is this going to end?
Well, see, the problem is that they're internationalists. They're not nationalists. In other words, there's no sense of America first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are America's interests? What are America's strategic interests? What do we need to do to preserve the United States, its power, its influence, its standing in the world?
Mm-hmm.
The British made this bad decision in 1914 to enter the First World War. Britain never completely recovered from the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
Then it repeated its mistake, put itself into a hopeless position that allowed FDR to bankrupt it and destroy it. And he was always the enemy of the British Empire. He took full advantage of the situation. So the British destroyed themselves, their standard of living, their wealth, their power, their influence, everything during the 20th century.
So we should have learned from them.
We are on the same road right now.
Yeah.
We are just as foolish, and they became caught up in some of these, what I call false moral arguments. We have a moral obligation to Belgium. No, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Belgium didn't even exist before, 1840 something?
Yeah, and also as a mother or as a father, do I want my son to die
Well,
on
of course,
that soil?
of course,
if he were to be deployed.
And the British were always very sensitive to that because the British population was not as large as, say, the population of Austria-Hungary or Germany or even France. And so there was a sense of limitation. One of the things that every British general was told when he took an army to the field, this is before 1914, is, look, this is all we've got. Don't lose it. Mm-hmm. Because there's not another army waiting at home to come and replace you. Mm-hmm. Well, that changes the complexion of your operation. Yeah. It means that you have an interest in avoiding fights. And you see, we came out of World War II, I think, as a nation, with the view, and it's not an unreasonable one, that the best way to avoid future war is by being prepared to fight one. Mm-hmm. All right, sounds good in theory. Mm-hmm. But there should have been a corollary that said, and just because you're prepared to fight one,
doesn't mean you need to keep
reason
fighting.
Why you should do
exactly,
it.
Because then you have to keep up the apparatus and the machinery. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what you should do is go back to the original thinking, which is, unless we're attacked and we ourselves are at risk, or our vital strategic interest is at risk, we don't fight.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we spent the first sort of 160 years as a regional hegemon. We're the regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Until recently, until we opened our borders at any rate, there's been nobody in the Western Hemisphere that could challenge us. Yeah. The Canadians certainly aren't interested in doing so. We've had good relations with them. And despite the problems with Mexico, that resolved itself in 1865 when we sent 50,000 troops to the border with Texas and told Napoleon III and 32,000 French troops to get the hell out of Mexico. End of discussion. Then we won the Spanish-American War and ejected the last vestige of European influence and power in our hemisphere. That was enough for us. We didn't have to invade Colombia or invade Bolivia. That was never required, never needed.
Yeah.
We don't even want to invade Mexico. There's never been any real interest in going there because there's too many Mexicans, and that would have a big impact on us, and we don't want to do it. Well, we've lost sight of that. Suddenly we determined that we're a regional hegemon, but we can also be a global hegemon. Mm-hmm. And we've lost our sense of balance.
Truth has a power of its own. It moves hearts and saves lives. It heals wounds and restores souls, but only if it is heard. That's why our enemies are working nonstop to suppress the truth. That's why LifeSiteNews is the most censored life, faith, and family news source in the world. They are working to keep you in the dark. They are working overtime to make you feel alone and forgotten. But God says, I will never forget you. God never leaves us without hope of victory. And LifeSiteNews will never stop sharing the truth that sets us free. We will tell the truth without fear. We will tell the truth without compromise. And as mainstream platforms silence us, we will build our own. That's why I'm pleased to announce today the launch of the new LSNTV app, which can bring all of LifeSiteNews' top video content direct to your phone, tablet, computer, and TV so that you can bypass the censors and keep fighting with us for life, faith, family, and freedom. Don't be alone in the darkness. We've been canceled. Fight the cancellation. Download the app.
And any attempt to write that has failed because, someone would stand up and say, and I've said this many, many times, and I said it when I was in the War Plans Division. There was no pushback in 1994 or 95 to this. If we're not under attack, why are we going there? Mm-hmm. Are we really equipped to go into these places?
Wish that the nation would have listened more to you.
Well, it's not just me. There were others, except again, as I've tried to point out, anybody who talked in those terms was out. Yeah. There's a man named Eikenberry. He made his reputation in Somalia. What a terrible place to say you made your reputation, but he did. And he was a big proponent for humanitarian intervention and nation building and all these things. He had a picture of Woodrow Wilson on his wall. And I was lieutenant colonel at the time, and he was a full colonel when I was in the War Plans Division. And he's a West Point graduated a couple of years ahead of me. And he and I had a couple of discussions, and I told him I didn't agree with this, and I thought he said, "Well, there's Woodrow Wilson on the wall," and I said, "Yeah, and he was the architect of disaster for the world. Yeah. We should never have intervened in that war." Whoa, no, we were promoting democracy. I said, "It didn't work."
Yeah, it didn't work.
I said, "You don't want to go down that road," but he felt strongly. I mean, he was a true believer. Well, he ends up as a 3-star, and then he's the ambassador in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Well, how did that happen? Because he was playing to the audience. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying he doesn't believe his own ideological nonsense. I think he did, probably still does, and we'll never see reality. You can't, because then you have to admit that your entire ideological structure and foundation is false. Yeah. And you can't say, I made a mistake. Yeah. But you can. I disagree with that, but unfortunately he didn't. And so you have these people that, for reasons I've outlined, who were elevated. So by the time you get into Iraq, and by the time you were there for, in 2007, you stand up and say what I did, or just leave. Yeah. Why don't you just leave? And I remember he said, well, that's impossible. Why would you say that? I said, because that's what we'll do. And that's back to my original point to the Europeans. What makes you think that we are permanently in Europe? I told a German audience that came to visit Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe with their students. So they were graduate students and so forth. And I said, this is 1999 after the Kosovo Air Campaign. I said, you really need to think long and hard about what you want to do as a nation and as a part of Europe. What are you talking about? I said, we will not be here forever. Oh, no, you will be here. And I said, no, we can't. We can't afford it. We'll never be here forever. It's an impossibility. You've got to deal with these problems. We Germans can never do anything. We can never lead anything ever ago. And I said, well, you're fools, because you must. You are the inevitable once and future king of Europe, whether you like it or not, for all the right reasons. Now, of course, with a massive influx of foreigners and the suicidal policies they've embraced, perhaps Germany is finished. But in 2000, it was very strong, very powerful. And I worked very hard with some European officers on how do you build a European command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance structure. Because that's what you need. It has to be space-based as well as terrestrial, so that you can orchestrate and organize your own defenses and make decisions about where you will or will not go and what you will and will not do. Very difficult, because there was always this pushback. No. We need America. America needs to lead.
So it's a codependency on both sides. America enjoyed the
Well, it's not-
influence.
we're not dependent on them.
No, but
Yeah.
enjoyed the power and the
Oh, yeah,
influence,
yeah.
you know.
They-
And
they-
the
yeah, it's-
Europeans were too much used to being led instead of developing an identity.
And of course, the exceptions to that are the British and the French, neither of which are great powers any longer, neither of which have the strength foundationally to do much of anything on their own. So what do? They attach themselves to our imperialist ventures and aims, thereby making themselves feel greater and more
Greater.
powerful.
Yeah.
And sadly, for the first time in my living memory, I watched the Germans do the same thing, which I thought was immensely stupid. I was absolutely certain that the Germans would stand up and say no to all of the stuff in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, they did little, but they still involved themselves. And now the last thing I thought they would do is involve themselves in this
With
Ukraine
yeah.
insanity.
Yeah.
All of the Europeans, they're just crazy. The Finns and the Swedes and the Germans, all these people, I've said, what are you doing? This is not the Soviet Union. And Russia today, it not only doesn't have the resources to take on all of Europe, it doesn't want to. It wants to do business.
And the Europeans are going to have the repercussions. I mean, the war is taking place close to their soil. It's the
Absolutely.
Americans are at a very safe distance.
Well, we're at a safe distance, but more important, we've got serious problems at home.
Yeah. And that's the last point that I would like to bring up on this wonderful conversation is, make America great again. This cannot be at the, the crowd that wants to make America great again cannot make Israel great again, serve the interests of another nation. It has to, in my view, it has to be in the upcoming elections, the candidates need to be vetted according to whom they truly want to serve, and how do we rebuild this country? And this is where I would like you to tell us a little bit about your organization, because it seems it might have to be a grassroots development that we rebuild and have conversations among citizens to open eyes and to say at the elections what we want and which candidate we want and which not, because this is further and further eroding this country, this expansionism, this interventionist policy over the world.
Well, I think the good news is that most Americans have discovered that these interventions overseas don't make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, most Americans continue to treat what happens beyond their borders with very limited interest, if any. If you go into our school systems, look at our educational system, what are we teaching people? I was always struck by the disparity, or not disparity, but the dramatic difference in the quality of education between what the average French or German or Swedish or Swiss, even Italian students, they were much more informed about the world. They had views that were based on fact, very little fantasy. Everything we talk about in the past is an exercise in self-congratulation with very little facts, and we just move on. And got to understand that if you live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I found these things out by living in various places in the United States, to be a successful American in Kansas City doesn't really require you to know much about anything. I mean, all you have to do is be willing to work hard. You have a grasp of basic math and basic, English, and you can buy a business or build a business, and you can be successful as long as you know the people in your community and you know what they want or what they can or can't do. In other words, you understand your region, you understand the supply chains in and out of your state, Kansas or Missouri. But you certainly don't need to know anything about Europe or Asia or anything else. Well, that's fine. Then what do you do when people are elected to office who know nothing? Nothing. And that's the hill. But they do know how to count, and they know where money comes from. And they listen very carefully to anyone who is in a position to make them wealthy. All you have to do is look at generations of people who have served in the Senate and the House, people with no business background or experience at all. Most people with no military experience or any experience in the foreign policy arena, most of whom know nothing about economics. In fact, large numbers of them are lawyers. And
Empty vessels to be filled by someone else.
Well, yes, but most important by the man with the cash.
Yeah.
If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, everybody talks about the Israel lobby, which is big and powerful, more powerful today than ever in our history. But don't forget the pharmaceutical industries. You know, don't look at the agricultural sector and ignore Monsanto and these other things. There's enormous cash out there. And that's what people who are elected figure out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And if you want to sit on the key committee, if you want to be the chairman or the vice chairman of that committee at some point, if you want to have a seat at the table in anything that's important to your district or your state, you need money. Mm-hmm. So where do you get it? Well, you can only go back to your home district so many times and ask for contributions. Pretty soon you have to accept the fact that, well, down the street are all these lobbies for all these various things. Which one seems to have an importance to you and your state, your district?
Yeah.
And then suddenly, you know, you realize, well, who controls the financial sector? Who controls the media? Where do those people stand? What do they think? They can make you or break you. And then, as people have noted recently, you have the intelligence communities. And they collect on our own members of Congress, apparently. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what some of these people have done, but I'm sure that there are things that they're probably not pleased with. I mean, look, everybody has something they're not proud of.
Yeah.
But there must be some really bad things happening that people don't want revealed. And I think that's also part of this. How many trips to Epstein Island do you have to
I
make?
was just thinking about that.
And that's one of the reasons I said, Washington is almost Epstein Island on steroids.
Yeah.
Everybody is hostage to something.
Yeah.
So who represents the interests of the United States and the American people? Look at that bill. Where's the evidence for defending the border?
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. We're sending billions to Taiwan,
Yeah.
not just Israel and Ukraine. Billions to Taiwan. For what? Mm-hmm. Who in their right mind would suggest that we should go to war with China over whom controls Taiwan? That's incredible. Mm-hmm. Why? What difference does it make to us? Mm-hmm. Well, they make microcircuitry. Well, you know, we did too at one point.
Yeah.
What's wrong with us?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese and we are all dependent on this superb, industry of microcircuitry that exists on Taiwan. I see no evidence that the Chinese are going to invade that place or want to. None whatsoever. Mm-hmm. But this has now become a drumbeat. Now, some of that is designed to justify runaway defense spending, which has been our problem, in my judgment, since the 60s and 70s. You know, after Vietnam, we were ruined financially as a nation. People don't realize that. Nixon did not wake up one morning and say, oh, gosh, I guess I'll take us off the gold standard. There was a reason for that. If he hadn't done it, we were looking at default. We were looking at economic catastrophe in the United States, a financial collapse. Mm-hmm. So it was supposed to be temporary. And like everything that starts in Washington as temporary, it becomes permanent.
Yeah.
Well, what do we do now? We're in much worse shape than we were in 1972 or 1975. Infinitely worse shape, financially and economically. How do we avoid Armageddon? Well, now people are saying, well, we can inflate our way out. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Anything that saves the banking system and the financial system that's controlled by the wrong people. Yeah. I don't think that'll work. But all I'm trying to say, there are lots of people with lots of interests and lots of cash. Yeah. Now, then the question is, how do you change this? And you were talking about grassroots. Well, grassroots sounds great in theory. But if you don't control the organs of power, which is what Lenin talked about when he took over in Russia, then you aren't going to get very far. What are the organs of power? The military, the police, and the intelligence services.
Yeah, and they are captured.
And they are more important today than they have ever been.
But wouldn't you think, for example, your organization, Our Country, Our Choice, this is a connecting of people nationwide, at least to exchange ideas, to strengthen the identity of those who want the common good of this country and, want truly to heal this country. And so...
Well, I would say one other thing. Our Country, Our Choice wants to unite people across party lines. Mm-hmm. We think there are lots of Democrats and Republicans who share a commonality of interest around core issues. We think everybody wants to end the current immigration disaster. Yeah. We want to defend our borders. We want to close this mess off. We want to restore the rule of law, which means we've got to expel these illegals.
Yeah.
And we have to crack down on criminality.
Truth has a power of its own. It moves hearts and saves lives. It heals wounds and restores souls, but only if it is heard. That's why our enemies are working nonstop to suppress the truth. That's why LifeSiteNews is the most censored life, faith, and family news source in the world. They are working to keep you in the dark. They are working overtime to make you feel alone and forgotten. But God says, I will never forget you. God never leaves us without hope of victory. And LifeSiteNews will never stop sharing the truth that sets us free. We will tell the truth without fear. We will tell the truth without compromise. And as mainstream platforms silence us, we will build our own. That's why I'm pleased to announce today the launch of the new LSNTV app, which can bring all of LifeSiteNews' top video content direct to your phone, tablet, computer, and TV so that you can bypass the censors and keep fighting with us for life, faith, family, and freedom. Don't be alone in the darkness. We've been canceled. Fight the cancellation. Download the app.
And that must happen. You know, everybody agrees with that. Whether you live in Philadelphia or Boston or Los Angeles, there are very few people disagree with that. They may disagree on methods and how you do it, but they all agree on that. Yeah. I think there's widespread agreement that we're financially insolvable and we've got problems and we've got to have to deal with those. And people would accept cuts to some extent in their budgets. But I think the next big issue for them is ending the overseas interventions. Mm-hmm. And people understand that, you know, you can have 50, 60,000 troops in Germany, or you can have another 50 or 60,000 troops here. So that means you can spend the money that's spent in Germany, mm-hmm. or you can spend it here. Mm-hmm. And they're no longer listening to the siren call of the neocon. Oh, you can't leave. Mm-hmm. If you leave, the world will fall apart. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, the world existed for thousands of years before we came around. Yeah. Exactly. It will exist for thousands of years after we leave. Mm-hmm. It's just like this nonsense about we can't let Russia win in Ukraine. welcome to the real world. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Mm-hmm. And instead of doing the stupid things you have, which is to cultivate hostility, anger, and hatred in Russia for us, we could have come to some sort of amicable solution. Yeah. And it's time to admit that NATO no longer serves the purpose it once did. Russia is not the Soviet Union. That's a lot of nonsense. But we can't go there yet. I mean, there's no willingness in Washington. And then I think we have to end these things like the sexualization of children in schools. Yeah. I mean, it's just the stuff I've been seeing and reading, to me, it's abhorrent, incomprehensible. Children are innocent and should be innocent as long as they can be innocent. I don't see the rush to destroy that innocence, don't understand it, but that seems to be part of this larger agenda. Yeah. I mean, these are just some of the things. Mm-hmm. And they're, you know, electoral integrity, our elections, how meaningful are they? I mean, it's just too much violation of law.
I mean, it's really a voice of common sense.
Well, you would think so, but common sense hasn't been very popular.
So how has been the response to your organization? How have people...
The response has been enormous, and it's very positive. But this gets to the heart of the matter. How do you really affect change? Well, there was a man, his name was Zumwalt. He was the chief of naval operations, an admiral in the United States, a brilliant man, by the way. Had a very tough time in the 70s. He was CNO under Richard Nixon. Zumwalt was a very competent, very intelligent man. So was his predecessor, by the way. You don't want to get boiled down in some of the good people that we've had in the military, but we've had a number of them. Admiral Moore was his predecessor. Great man. Zumwalt talked about how do you achieve change in the Navy? And he failed. And he said, I failed to make the changes that I thought were important, and this is why. He said, you have to have three things. He said, you have to have people at the bottom that support you, because then they can reach upwards. He said, but then you have to put people in charge at the top who believe in it, who can push down against the middle. And he said, then on the outside, you have to have people in Congress who want to support the change. And he said, so you have three things moving simultaneously. Getting Congress on board is probably not going to happen because too many people have figured out it's not in their interest, personal interest, to change a damn thing. So I don't bet heavily on Congress. We just saw, for instance, an attempt to remove this man, Mike Johnson. And I was so disappointed when he was appointed, because all you had to do is look at where he gets his money from, and you said, my God, we're electing a disaster. This man's not his own man. So he's just performed exactly as I would have expected. And a lot of people have said, well, he meant well, he tried hard, he's a good, all this kind of nonsense. We got to go along. You always have the majority that wants to go along.
This explanation costs us $100 billion.
Yeah. Well, it's not just that. It's there's much more at stake than just the cash. And then, you had, 21 or some number of people that voted to oust him, or, it was some small number. Well, that's our problem right now.
Yeah.
You have the few courageous people. Andrew Jackson used to say, one man with courage makes a majority, and that certainly worked for him. But today it's tough. So you need a much larger force. OCOC can be that force in many ways, a foundation for something different, something new. But at the same time, that something different, something new has to fight its way to the top. And we'll have to see what happens. If we get the financial emergency that I think is coming, it'll be easier. Because once that occurs, people will be willing to say, well, that hasn't worked. And by the way, I can't buy enough food anymore. I can't put fuel in my gas tank.
It's kind of a pruning process.
Yeah, maybe we need to go with these people over here. I think that can happen. And we're trying to recruit good people. And I think we have some good people. But we're not there yet. You can't, certain things are in the hands of Providence. Providence will make the decision, not us.
Yeah.
And so that's why, somebody said, what do you recommend? And I said offhandedly, ora et labora.
That's beautiful.
Work and pray.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't know this, but, you go through these Cistercian monasteries that run through the center of Germany, because that used to be the border of the Germanic world until the Germanic peoples who were Christianized pushed to the east. And you go into these things, you see that, frequently on the wall, ora et labora. Well, there's much sense in that. There are too many people that talk about ora, and they forget the labora part. You've got to do both.
Yeah. And you can't have activism without asking God's protection and guidance. No,
so I think Providence has a role, and I think Providence will intervene in ways. It's sort of like the hidden hand that Smith used to talk about in capitalism. I see that as the divine influence. Of course, some people say, well, you're obviously delusional. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, this has become very popular to pour buckets of filth and abuse over anybody who says, no, I really think there's something beyond this life, and I believe that there is the hidden hand of Providence.
Look at the world that they create who don't believe in divine providence.
It's a pretty frightening
they create
place.
a hell on earth.
Yeah.
That's not a good argument.
And I think we have evidence of that in 70 years of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody, including Putin, would deny that.
No.
Just look at the flip inside the Soviet Union, this dramatic 180-degree switch turn away from sort of materialistic atheism, which is nihilism. It's destructive. It leads nowhere. It's nothing. But we have a lot of that in the current leadership at the top. And a lot of people succumb to it because they say, it's overwhelming. It's too much. No, it isn't. It's not as overwhelming as you think. And that's why we keep telling members of OCOC, you are not alone. Don't think you're alone. If you think you are, call us, send us an email, talk to us. We'll tell you aren't alone. We have 370,000 people now who've joined it. 370,000 people.
That's impressive.
And we've only really been around doing anything since January, and we haven't really invested heavily in marketing.
That's beautiful. If that's not a hand of providence, a blessing of trying to connect the good people to reinforce each other and to give courage to speak up or to form the minds.
By the way, I've been approached by people who are Muslims who said to me, you sound like you're a very Christian organization. I said, well, yeah, everybody's a Christian. Well, could I join as a Muslim? I said, well, that depends on what you believe in. And I said, I'm not talking about theology. You obviously believe in God. That's good. You have the 10 Commandments. It's fine. So what do you believe in? And then he said, well, I don't believe in the sexualization of children. I don't believe in
that's a
open
common
borders.
ground. Yeah.
I don't think we should be fighting. I said, come on board, you know.
Yeah.
And the same thing is true for someone who is Jewish. We have some that have said, you know, well, you have this on everything you write. You talk about the truth setting you free. You know, that's in the New Testament. I said, yeah, and we think it works. Is that a problem for you? He said, well, it depends on how you interpret it. In other words, people are saying, well, you're too Christian.
Well, we are a Christian nation originally.
Well, yeah, but, you know, we respect other people's views. And as I like to point out, I haven't seen very many Buddhists who started any wars. So I have enormous respect for Buddhism and enormous respect for Hinduism for the same reason, because the underlying tenets and philosophy are very, very positive, very good. If you look at the history of Christian Europe, it's pretty bleak. We have too many people killing each other for too long for dumb reasons. Now, again, this goes back to why people thought NATO, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had a role to play. That role was to prevent any further conflicts from happening. And I would have expected, if NATO were real, instead of trying to drag Ukraine in, would have been more concerned about the people that are there and saying your best option is neutrality. You can be a bridge between us and Russia. You know, this is a comfort zone for Russia, and it can be helpful to you, and you can be very prosperous. Look at Austria. You know, look at Sweden and Finland. Well, we didn't do that. We did the opposite. So I think Europeans are sobering up. Now, when you go to Asia, there's no one in Asia interested in going to war except us. Everybody says, what about that crazy man in North Korea? You know, what about him? What's he done? His principal concern is his own survival. And we had a chance under President Trump to begin denuclearizing that peninsula. But you had to recognize something. We have to leave. We do. We have to leave the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
Now, under what conditions do you want to leave? Do you want to get something for your departure? I'm not sure we can anymore. But at the time that President Trump approached it, we could. The last thing the Chinese want is a war. So, well, they're evil, they're bad, they're doing well, wait a minute. The Chinese are Chinese, and they are an economic power. Everybody wants to trade with them, and everybody will. China is the manufacturing center of the world. By the way, it was for a few thousand years, and then it fell apart. Well, it's back. Now, you can either do business with them, or you can fight them.
Yeah.
I prefer to do business with them. But you could put restrictions on them. And so he said, well, what about the Chinese this? I said, look, close your borders. Get control of your airports, your seaports.
Yeah, keep an eye.
Take all these Chinese that have come here illegally, they go home or they're out. You know, why do we let the Chinese go into our laboratories? Why do we let them into our businesses, our corporations? We've done that to ourselves. And then you are surprised that the Chinese are stealing intellectual property and sending it to the motherland. They've been doing this for 2,000 years. The Japanese and the Koreans will tell you this is typical Chinese behavior. And they'll say to you, how many Chinese do you see in our labs? How many do you see in our universities? The Koreans and the Japanese know what they're dealing with, so do the Vietnamese. It doesn't require you to go to war. It does require you to be prudent, to exercise self-defense on many different levels.
Exactly, on many levels.
And we don't do it.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with China. And they said, well, look at all the ships they're building. How about all the cracks in the hulls? How about all the people in the shipbuilding industry in China who've been arrested for corruption? Oh, I didn't know that. You know, they just inspected the rocket forces, the elites in the Chinese military, and they found that half the rockets, these are ballistic missiles designed for use against us, or cruise missiles if we try to invade China. The fuel wasn't in these things. They sold the fuel. I mean, come on, this is China. This is not Imperial Japan. And everyone looks past Japan. Well, they're an aging population. Oh, the Japanese. Japan is a very powerful state. Extraordinarily intelligent, capable people. We don't need to police Asia.
Yeah.
We need to get out of it. Yeah. We need to demilitarize our relationship with Asia. Yeah. But as soon as you say that, you'll have the whole U.S. Navy and Marine Corps up in arms, because without that, what do they do? Yeah. But that brings me to the other thing that people don't understand. The forces we have today are simply anachronistic. They are still tributes to the Second World War. One of the things that has worked very well for the Russians is that they have fundamentally rethought warfare. They have a new force now. They have new ways of doing business. They've organized differently. They've adapted. We haven't done any of that. And what we have will not work in the future. So if we want to avoid something like Pickett's charge, there was a Colonel Dunn, great person. Rich Dunn wrote this piece, and it was all about change in warfare. And he wrote it when he was at the National Defense University. And he said, everyone's on the march to Gettysburg and wants to join Pickett's charge. Anyone with any sense knew this frontal assault's not going to work. Now, Lee thought that this massive artillery bombardment had had more effect than it did. But that's something else we've learned, that strikes, overhead strikes, don't always achieve what you think they have. Well, you know the rest of the story. Pickett's charge was an immense failure. We're going to end up like Pickett unless we go into these forces and make profound change. But right now, the combination of ignorance and self-interest on the Hill, and I would argue self-delusion and self-interest in Department of Defense, will prevent anything from changing. Because if you're in the Navy, what do you want to do? You want to stand on the deck of a carrier with the wind blowing through your face with your scarf on and, whoa, look at my fleet. Those days are over. You're not going to need a giant Jutland-style, Midway-style fleet, not that structure at all. On the other hand, what you're doing in space and what you do beneath the oceans is vital and essential, and that can be dramatically expanded. Nobody really wants to go there. Everyone is clinging tenaciously to the obsolete, everything. And what is obsolete? This notion of American political, military, financial hegemony is obsolete. Our armed forces, the structure, the focus, the orientation, the mentality is obsolete. And ultimately, this notion of the nation that can be everything and nothing, that an American can be anything, and therefore if an American can be anything, then America is nothing. No. There is such a thing called an American. They're real. I'm one, you are, everybody in the room is. We are not accidentally Americans. We did not wash up with driftwood on the beach. We are really Americans. There is an American people, culture, mentality, thinking. That was wiped away as a result of these two world wars. It's coming back. People are realizing this is not what we are about. This is not what our mission in the world is.
Exactly, and that's really, we hope so much that with the help of your organization and these conversations that we come back to these roots and, find ourselves.
And by the way, we haven't said much about that, but what's happening in Israel today is an example of what we are not. Now, does this mean that we have not made mistakes, that we have not committed atrocious acts in ours? Of course not. Every people, every nation, you make mistakes, and you're supposed to learn from them and improve progressively through fault. Well, we've figured a lot of these things out. There are things that we would never do today that we did in 1901 in the Philippines, where we killed 250,000 Filipinos in an occupation that was unnecessary in a place we had no business being, but we did it because we thought we were supposed to demonstrate our power and that Philippines was vital to us. Well, guess what happened after that? For the next 40 years, we tried to get rid of the Philippines because it's a strategic liability. We were trying to offload the Philippines all through the 30s. MacArthur was given specific permission by Franklin Roosevelt that if he could negotiate neutrality for the Philippines with the Japanese emperor, we would leave the Philippines because we knew we couldn't defend it. Well, that failed. And we know the rest of that particular story and that tragedy, what happened in the Philippines. And I keep trying to tell people, we need to understand that if we're not careful around the world, in the Middle East, North Central Africa, wherever we go, we could end up on the way to Bataan. In other words, with thousands of American soldiers captured and marched off in ignominious retreat and defeat. We don't want that. And it's not necessary. It can be avoided. Well, MacArthur tried. He failed. The rest is history. We have too many people sitting right now in Syria, very vulnerable. Same thing in Iraq. People say, well, look, we faced off those Iranians. The Iranians haven't done anything. These Shiite militias are not there to kill us. But if we take on Iran directly, they will. Same thing is true with Hezbollah. We need a different solution in the Middle East. And one of those with Israel is to live with its neighbors. Now, it's not easy, especially when you've had, how many years? 70 years of hostility and fighting. But
there still would be ways.
But we did have success after 73. And tragically, we now have Sisi warning Israel, if it doesn't cease and desist in Gaza, that he's going to renounce the terms of the 73 Camp David Accords, which I think would be catastrophic, because that opens the door to much more.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that the Turks, the Iranians, are not hapless fools. These are not Bedouin Arabs that have no air defenses, that have no armies, that have no air forces, that can be bombed at will. They have high concentrations of smart human capital. They have exceptional capabilities in all sorts of areas, from cyber to in rocketry. It doesn't make any difference. These people are not pushovers. They have resisted intervention, thank God, to this point. But there's no guarantee that that will continue.
Yeah.
And there was an attempt on the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia's life quite recently. That's a bad sign, because what that says, he had announced that he was prepared to return to normalization with Israel. His population will have nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
So the hatred, the violence is metastasizing in the region.
Yeah.
We have
And
proven
we are not helping.
we have proven completely inept. We are so busy saying, "Oh, I'm going to fight for Israel. I love Israel. We want Israel, please."
Yeah.
And where's my money? Reward me for my fealty. This is a bad situation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have
It's
large
actually
numbers.
not helping them, and it's not helping us. It really
is not.
It's not being a good friend,
A friend of mine, in fact, he's not really a friend. This is another person, Jeffrey Sachs. And he said that what is being done to Judaism as a result of this is catastrophic. I've simply thought that Netanyahu has put the very existence of his state at risk unnecessarily.
Yeah.
There were various ways to respond to what happened on the 7th of October. It's also open to question what happened on the 7th of October.
Yeah.
How could that have
Many
ever
questions.
happened? I'm still suspending disbelief. But in the final analysis, what we're doing right now is going to make matters worse. It's not going to help anything.
Oh, it's a genocide.
And hundreds of thousands of people are going to be killed.
Yeah.
And this will not go unnoticed. There was a program called Shoah, all about the Holocaust, which had a profound impact on me. And this particular lady was English, married to a German, and she described something that had happened to her on a train ride, and this was just before the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive in December of 1944. And she got into this compartment, and of course everything was dark. They didn't put lights on at night because you didn't want to attract attention and so forth. And this was a train that was moving from Berlin west. And she sat down, and after she'd been there, she suddenly realized in the dark, sitting across from her was this man in uniform. And then the moonlight came in, and she saw, "Oh my God, this is a Waffen-SS officer," and she was afraid. And he said, "Don't be afraid of me. You have nothing to be afraid of." And she said, "Well, he said, would you talk to me?" And she said, "Of course." And he said, "I'm from Latvia, and I joined the German armed forces because they liberated my family. My father was in jail." I mean, this is this whole terrible thing that the Bolsheviks had done to them.
Yeah.
And then he said, "I was assigned to this unit that was sent into the countryside, and they rounded up these Jews from a village, and we were supposed to shoot them. And this little Jewish boy was standing next to this elderly man, and the elderly man was obviously his grandfather, and he said to the child, 'Don't worry, my child. God is watching what happens today.'" And then, of course, he said, everybody opened fire. He said, I could not do this. He said, "I shot in the air." So he said, "I immediately requested transfer."
Yeah.
And I wanted to be in the fighting side of it, so I ended up with the Waffen-SS, and I guess he was the equivalent at that point of a captain or something. And he said, "I've fought everywhere. I've fought in many, many battles." And he said, "But I keep surviving."
Yeah.
And this nightmare stays with me.
Wow.
But I keep surviving. Train stopped somewhere, Celle or somewhere in North Germany. She got out, and he continued. And she said, I don't know what happened to him.
Yeah, that's
But she
beautiful.
said that was the war.
That's
Well, somewhere along the line, someone in Israel must be experiencing something
yeah.
similar.
I know.
And, that's what I think about.
Yeah.
So for me as an American, I look at this and I can't do this.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that, I don't think that, I agree with Bernie Sanders and others, I don't think that makes us anti-Semites.
No.
I'm not calling for the destruction of Jews, and I wouldn't support that either.
Of course.
If there were 2.3 million Jews there, I would be just as opposed to this.
But with any friend, I mean, you would always want your friend to do what's right. That's true friendship. As a good patriot, would always try to call his country to a better standard, and instead of covering up for its vices.
Yeah. Well,
So that's actually, you are being a true friend of Israel.
they don't think so right now.
I know, but I thank you, and also for speaking that way to our American public, that people can reflect on this situation in another way. And I thank you for your heart that you just showed. This is finally, we are humans, and we are finally wanting to stand before God with a clean conscience about what we have done here on earth. It's a very short time on earth.
Preferably.
Exactly. And so I thank you so much for this conversation, for giving us so many things to look in a different light on from the last 30 years, or let's go 60, 70, how many years?
There's one
you
last
covered.
thing I did want to say.
Yeah.
You talked to me about having graduated from West Point, which is true. I graduated in June of '76. Next year will be 50 years, which is hard to believe. But I want to point out, since we are in Virginia, I did spend a year at the Virginia Military Institute, and my brother rats would be furious if I didn't bring that up, because my brother rats have been very good to me and very loyal to me through tough times, and I appreciate that, which tells you a little bit about VMI and also what that was like in those days.
Yeah,
So, anyway.
that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you so much, Colonel Macgregor. This is Maike Hickson, LifeSiteNews. Thank you very much for listening.